He only scoops the snow whenever it snows a lot, but that's as far as I've seen him.
We have to scoop our own snow.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you for being here. It's, as you know, very wicked and nasty outside. And I personally don't know why Wayne State did not cancel classes or close campus, or they must have some privy to some information that I just don't have, because it seems like they made a bad call by keeping class.
They don't have to cancel the basketball game either.
It's like it's a little irresponsible.
I don't know. I guess I'll just never understand it. So, but anyways, here we are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your dedication. We'll get through what we can get through today, and then we'll let you back out into the snow.
No thanks.
Yeah. So first of all, I do want to say I did get a couple messages, emails from both of the Daltons in this class saying that they're not going to be here today. So, and I didn't expect everyone to be here today. I'm actually pleased that there's, 9 of us here today? Yeah, that's pretty good. I do not have your homework finished grading because of all the chaos that's been going around here. I'm just about done. I've just got the last part writing section on the bottom to grade. So I won't be able to get that back to you until Wednesday, because we don't have class on Monday, do we? Right, so, yeah, so it's going to be a long time until we meet again. It's probably good that we're...
On Sunday.
Yeah, if you're having withdrawal symptoms on Monday, just,
It's like, I'll wake up at 8 a.m.
Just please hold on to
yeah, right.
I was up at 7 o'clock this morning.
Okay, so, in the light of present circumstances, and because we don't have everyone here, I just thought, you know what, I better not collect the homework today. I mean, we'll certainly go over it, but I better not collect it today just because some people can't be here. And, well, I didn't quite finish the other batch, so we're going to go over all the answers in your workbook about all those 9 chord tones. And let's go ahead and get started. The first page that I asked you to look at was it page 93?
Yeah.
Okay. Page 93, I asked you to do just number 1 there, I believe. Yep, section A, number 1. And we can certainly look at the music, but I'm going to show you what I have in terms of 9 chord tones for that problem, and then we'll go to the next page after that, unless you have questions. So I have, in measure 6, I have a passing tone. Measure 7, a 7/6 suspension, followed by a passing tone. Measure 8, a neighbor tone, followed by a passing tone. Measure 10, a passing tone. And then measure 11, a 7/6 suspension, followed by a passing tone. And this is all regarding example 820 on page 126. Yeah, it was asking you what were the non-chord tones in the solo horn part in that example. Let me know if you, yes, okay, question.
I mean, I understand how, like, typically how you get the 7/6 suspension, but can you explain how you did on this example? Because for some reason I just couldn't.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
I thought, like, I don't know why I did it. Yeah,
I thought this is just like about
Yeah. Remember, there's only 4 possible types of suspensions. There's the 9/8, the 7/6, the 4/3, and the 2/3. Okay. So apparently one of the suspensions, it looks like, was in measure 7. Okay, so do you see this is on the very top step. You see the G there in parentheses.
Yeah.
That is the suspension. It's a non-chord tone. The authors told us that, and put it in parentheses for us, that it doesn't fit in the harmony. It's approached by the same note, you see that in the prior measure, and then it's left by a step down. That makes it a suspension, first of all. Okay? Now, how do you calculate which of the 4 types of suspensions it is? Well, you have to identify what is the interval size or interval distance from that G in the horn all the way down to the bass. all the way down to the bass note. If you see below it in measure 7, the bass is on an A. The bass is on an A. So what is the interval between the A in the bass and the G up above it? That should be a seventh, right? Then the G goes down a step, as suspensions always do. It goes down a step, and the resolution note that it goes to, which is an F, what interval does that create above the bass? Well, A up to the F, the same bass note A, up to the F is a sixth. So that gives us the final answer of it should be a 7/6 suspension. 7/6 suspension. And that's how I calculate the specific or the precise type of suspension. I always calculate the interval distance between the suspended and resolution notes above the lowest pitch of all, above the bass. You can skip all those notes in the middle. Just go all the way down to the bottom. Okay, and then, let's see, that happened, did that happen in measure 11? Yeah. Measure 11, the same thing happens again. I think it's the exact same notes. Yeah. Good. Other questions about one of the non-chord tones that was in this passage? All right. Then should we go to page 99 in the workbook? Oops, I'm in an older edition. I gotta go to a different page. Here we go. Okay, so I asked you to do all 4 on this page. And if I look at number 1, I guess I could look at number 1 and 2. Number 1, you should have escape tone, appoggiatura, appoggiatura. Based on that musical example that referred you to. And if you have questions about these, do let me know. I can go back into the book and show the music on the screen. Number 2, for that example, in measure 10 I got an appoggiatura, same thing in measure 11. Measure 13 I got a passing tone, 14 a passing tone, 15 a 9/8 suspension, 16 violin a 9/8 suspension, and finally in the piano I got a 4/3 suspension and a retardation. And I don't mind which order you write those in. You could list the retardation and 4/3, or you could do the 4/3 and then the retardation. Yes.
Let me look at the measure 16 piano part.
Yeah. And let's see, what the page is that? 156, 157. Okay, so we're looking at this right here. Now, as I was telling a student before class, it seems to me like it would be a little clearer if the 2 parentheses on the insides of the notes were just deleted completely. And there was one parentheses over here and then a closed parentheses over here. I'd like you to think of both of those notes as kind of like one and the same non-chord tone, one and the same pitch. So I look at it like this G is preceded by the same note and the G is left by a step down. And so that makes that a suspension. What kind of suspension? Well, we have G, this time above a bass note of D. D up to G is a 4th. The resolution note F, or in this case I believe it's F sharp, that above the same bass note D is a 3rd. So I got a 4/3 suspension for that voice. Now underneath this voice, the C sharp is preceded by the same note in the prior measure, and it's left by a step up. You see how the C sharp goes up to in the middle pitch to the D? And what non-chord tone is preceded by the same note and left by a step up? Retardation. That's right. And you don't have to go any further with retardations. You don't have to specify any intervals with them, like suspensions or anything like that. So that's how I got those 2 non-chord tones in that measure. And then, what did I say was in the top voice? Oh yeah, that's a suspension as well. It's approached by the same note, left by a step down. And what interval is E above a D? The ninth, and then the resolution of D above a D is an octave or an eighth. So 9/8 suspension for that. Good. Other questions about this? Okay. Moving right along then. I think I'm on number 3. Okay. Violin 1, measure 23 a passing tone, 24 an appoggiatura, 25 a passing tone, 26 an appoggiatura. The second violin line, measure 23, I got a passing tone. 26, the first one, I would accept retardation or pedal, depending on if you consider that note a separate entity in and of itself versus coupling it as the same note as this one was. So retardation or pedal, then you need a retardation, and then the last one is a neighbor tone.
Do you know why in that one they wrote it them as separate and then in number 2 they didn't? Do you know why they did that?
I don't. If they did it differently, then your guess is as good as mine. I don't understand the rhyme or reason for things that are inconsistent a lot of times. And if I'm ever inconsistent, do let me know. Because I might be, I don't know, I might be on cloud 9 or on a different planet that day. But yeah, that's a good point. So this is on measure 1, or page 140. And I was just looking at, where is it, right here. And for instance, this one, I would say, you could call that a pedal tone because it's approached by the same note and left by the same note. But if you want to group this one and this one as the same type of non-chord tone, you could say both of these are approached by the same note and they're left by a step up. So it kind of depends on how you look at it. You want to isolate each note individually, or do you want to just, because they're the same pitch and they're right next to each other, one after the other, you just want to group them and think of them as one and the same type of non-chord tone. Okay. So, yes. Any other questions that I may not be able to answer? All right. Now, the last part, the Mozart piano example. There were supposed to be no non-chord tones in the bass voice, in the left hand. Let's see if I can stretch this out a little more. There you go. Let's go this way and shrink it down just a little bit. First of all, take a look at the Roman numeral analysis. This is to reflect the chord tones. And all the notes in the left hand of the piano or in the bass voice were chord tones. So the first chord I have in this passage is 5-4-3, then followed by a 1, then a 6. Excuse me, then a 1-6, 2-6, 1-6, 4, 5, 7, and 1. This is actually just, it's actually yanked from the middle of a phrase. So that's why it starts on a weird chord like a 5-4-3 rather than a 1. It's just pulled out of, in fact, it starts at measure, they just started it at measure 61. They just pulled about 4 measures out right there from the actual piece. Now, if those are the chords and the chord tones are in the left hand or the bass voice, then let's see what we have in terms of non-chord tones up above. Well, the G sharp in B2 I have as a neighbor tone. That doesn't fit in the D, F sharp, A, C chord. There's a couple passing tones right next to each other, an A sharp and a B. They don't fit into harmony. And then the very last note in the right hand of the first measure, that C sharp, that also doesn't belong. And it's approached and left by step in the same direction. So it's a passing tone. Did you get all those in that measure? You got to kind of, it's almost like you got to take a magnifying glass and go in there like, whoa, 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 whoa. There's a billion notes here. What do I do? What do I do with them all? Okay, then in the second measure, in the top voice, I only got one non-chord tone, and that's the second to last 16th note. It doesn't fit in the GBD chord, and based on how it's approached and left, I called it an appoggiatura. It's approached by a skip or leap, and it's left by a step. That's an appositeur. In the next measure, I have another appositeur right at the beginning, and then I have an appositeur on beat 3, followed by, it looks like a neighbor tone towards the end of that measure. And all of these non-chord tones in the last measure you can just ignore. I didn't count any, I don't count anything in the last measure. Because it's just, it's like there's a chord on the downbeat, then it stops, and then all you have is a single melodic line, so there's no harmony there. And I don't really care to mess around with all those little tiny notes, especially when there's no harmony underneath it for most of the measure.
What did you label it as?
Say that again?
What did you label it as?
I label it as a CT. I call that a changing tone. There's one other type of non-chord tone that I just don't feel we need to discuss. It's called a changing tone. It's a little more involved than your regular standard type of non-chord tone. It also comes with different names. It's also called a double neighbor. It's also called a cambiata. It's very confusing.
Neighboring group, like you
Yeah, neighbor group. Yeah, the book. That's another term. Very good. Yeah. I don't feel, we're not going to see much of that, so I don't feel we need to know that, but it is in your book. I could give you a page reference if you really want to study it.
Alright.
But yeah, so don't worry about measure 4 at all. These are the ones, the 4 that I have in the first measure, there's 1 in the second measure, and then I have 3 non-chord tones in the third measure. That'd be what I'd be looking for. Yeah. I'll go ahead and, even though it's out of context, I do like you to hear what you analyze, so I'll see if I can play this short passage on the piano for you. It's really in the key of G, but it starts out like this. Actually, if you ever get a chance to hear it, it's the second movement of one of Mozart's piano sonatas. It's super duper music. It's very great. If you don't know it, you should just spend time. I wish we had the time to listen to the whole thing, but we don't. Anyways, fantastic piece. Just wanted to show you some of the various types of non-chord tones that Mozart uses in this particular passage. Okay, any other questions before we move on? Today we're going to stop reviewing, we're going to learn something new, we're going to learn something, well, everything we learn in here is important, but it's pretty weighty, it's pretty important, so I'm glad you're here. I'm going to use an example in your textbook on page 95, and I'll put it up on the board so you can see it. On the bottom of page 95. And today I'd like to just start discussing, we won't finish it today, we'll have to finish the discussion next week, but I'd like to start discussing what's called in music harmonic progression. Harmonic progression. And basically that's a fancy way of saying, how do you know how to string several chords together in a row to make a phrase or some kind of succession of chords? How do you know what chords work well after certain chords and what chords will come before chords and work well? How do we know how those all fit together? So you could ask yourself at this point, which chord successions are typical of tonal harmony and which ones are not? Why is it, for instance, that some chord progressions seem to head or drive toward a goal, while other chord progressions seem to wander aimlessly without any sense of direction? Right? If I didn't know anything about harmonic progression and I just wanted to start writing a bunch of harmonies or composing a piece, I could put a bunch of harmonies together, but what if they sound like they're just wandering aimlessly and don't have a sense of direction? Well, let me go ahead and I'll take this book over to the piano. Let me play both of these progressions, if I can sight read them for you, and see if you like the sound of one versus the other. In other words, which of these two examples, the top one or the bottom one, sounds like it has a sense of direction or is more goal-oriented? Here we are in G major. So the first one sounds something like... Now, the next progression, the one underneath, sounds like this. Oh, excuse me. I can't even play it. What do you think? Is that bottom example satisfying to you? Now, I know I didn't play it super duper perfect, but my goodness, that one just sounds like it's wandering and just doesn't go anywhere. Whereas the first progression sounds like, hey, we're moving forward, we're making progress, we're heading towards a definite goal, and by the time we get to the end, I can hear that we've reached that goal. We've reached some sort of satisfaction, at least, even if it's small. Okay. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we need to learn about how chords behave, how they function, and how they relate to each other, so that we know how to string them together in a succession to make progressions that are very directed and goal-oriented sounding, rather than aimless wandering. All right, so the reason the first progression sounds like it's more forward-moving and goal-oriented than the second is that each chord in the first one has a role or function to play in the grand scheme of harmony, and the composer knew how to exploit that, how to arrange each of the functions in the first progression to head towards a goal, whereas in the second progression, none of that was really taken, it wasn't important to whoever wrote that. It was just kind of left alone then. Okay, so I guess what I'm saying is each chord has a natural inclination to move to certain chords, while at the same time other chords have a natural inclination to, or a tendency to resist going to other harmonies. Okay. For instance, I'll give you a real quick example. This chord progression, and by the way, a progression of chords, all you need is a minimum of 2 chords. One chord moving to one other, that's the minimum you need for a progression. That's called a progression. And in the style of music we're studying, 4 going to 5 is very good. A 4 chord moving to a 5 chord is very common. You hear it all the time. It's very traditional. It's very, it's just very stylistic in the type of music that we're studying. But the reverse, taking a 5 chord in music in a key and moving it to a 4 chord is, ugh, it's terrible. You should never do that in this style of music we're studying. This is frowned upon and is never done by composers, again, in the style of music that we're studying. But you might say, well, Dr. Hawkins, why can you do 4 to 5, but you can't do the reverse 5 to 4? What is it about these chords that lets you know you are able to do this, but you shouldn't do this? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, probably for the rest of the class, and I'm going to give you a handout in a moment. All of the diatonic, I guess I should say, there are 7 diatonic chords in music, right? Because if you look at and build a chord on each degree of the scale, we're going to get 7 total harmonies there. And the way that they create highly goal-oriented progressions is when they're used in the proper order. And the proper order can be summarized by this diagram on this handout that I'm going to give you to explain that to you in the next several minutes. Hmm. Oh, you have it. Excellent. Wonderful. I guess I'll put mine up here. Okay, we're going to start by looking at this diagram in the upper left. Again, since I don't know that I've ever been tested or evaluated officially, but I believe I'm a visual learner, so I like to use pictures if I can. All right, let's look at that diagram there. All of the diatonic triads except for one can be grouped into three categories that define their behavior or main function in music. And the three categories or functions that chords fall into in this type of music are called tonic function, predominant function, and dominant function. You see the headings in each of those boxes. Okay? You can think of the function of a chord as its behavior, how it relates to the harmonies or chords around it. Oops. Okay? So all of the diatonic chords except for one can fit into or be categorized into one of these three functions. By the way, just looking at all the Roman numerals in each of these boxes, which diatonic chord or which Roman numeral is omitted or is left out? That's right, the 3 chord. The 3 chord is not found in any one of those function boxes. The 3 chord, we'll find out later on this semester, is very rare. It's not used all that much. It doesn't have a strong function, and there's only special ways that we can use the 3 chord properly, and that comes later in the semester. So you don't have to worry about the 3 chord for right now.
Is it safe to assume that this is only for major? We're not going to be minor yet?
No, that's a good question. The functions actually hold true in minor keys as well. This is just to save space. I only have the triads that are diatonic to major keys in here, but a minor one and a capital 6 would fit in the tonic box, and so on and so forth. So minor, the chords that fit in, the Roman numerals for minor keys function the same way, I should say. Yes.
So would the, like in a minor key, would the diminished second still go to?
Yeah, the 2 diminished would still go in the predominant box. There would be a minor 4 in there instead of a major 4, and there'd be a capital 6. You bet. Mm-hmm. Okay, now, when chords with these functions are strung together in the order tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic, when they're strung together and used in that order, that is clockwise around the diagram, you see behind the boxes there's this clockwise arrow. That's normal chord flow, normal chord progression flow. And when you use them in that order, goal-oriented, sensible-sounding music results. So, let's go ahead and, oh, by the way, did you notice that the 6th chord is found in 2 of the function boxes? That's not a mistake. That's actually correct. Let me just, when a 6th chord comes after a 5 chord, like a 5 chord here in the dominant box going to a 6th chord, then the 6th chord in that progression has what's called tonic function. But when the 6th chord comes after anything else besides a 5, like when it comes after a 1 or some other chord, then the 6th chord possesses what we say it has predominant function. Predominant function. And predominant, by the way, doesn't mean that, oh, it's super important, it's the most predominant chord of all. No. Predominant in this case means coming before a dominant chord. Get it? Predominant. Coming before a dominant. So we'll find out that in music, chords like 2, 4, and 6, they love to come right before a chord with dominant function. All right. As long as at least one chord from each category is used in a clockwise order, that string of chords is called a well-formed progression. So, and by the way, let's just get into the habit for the sake of argument here of always starting a chord progression with a chord in the tonic function box. The best thing to do is always start a chord progression with a 1 chord. Okay? So, let's say I'm in a major key. We can do C major, it doesn't matter. I'm going to write a short chord progression, a good chord progression, a chord that has goal-oriented direction to it. So I'm going to start with a 1, then I think I'm going to come down and choose a predominant chord. Which one do you want to use? 2, 4, or 6? 6? Okay. Then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to choose a dominant functioning chord. Which one do you want to use?
164.
Okay, and 164 always has to be coupled with
5.
5. And then after that, I'm going to go back to the tonic function again. And so I'm going to end up with a 1. I could put a 6 chord there, but that won't sound as final sounding, I guess, as going to 1. Now, let me go ahead and label the function of these chords. And I'm going to use the abbreviation or first letter of each function. So this chord, this is a tonic functioning chord. I'm going to label it with a T. This chord turns out to be the predominant chord in the progression. I'm going to label it PD, not police department or anything like that. Both of these come as a package, and those together, they stand for a 5, which is all dominant. So these two together are dominant in function. I'll label them with a D. And then my final 1 chord is tonic in function.
So if you only put a 164 without the 5, are you just a bad person?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you do like just the 5 without the 7?
Yes. Yeah. The 5 or the 5/7. That's right. That's exactly right. So I guess what I'm trying to say is because I've used the chords in the correct order, in the clockwise order, tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic, and I've used at least 1 chord from each box. When I start with a tonic function, use at least 1 from each box, and end with a tonic function, I have what's called in music, at least in this style of music, it's the best sounding type of progression you can write. It's known as a well-formed progression. Oops. It's the most complete, full-sounding progression that runs the whole circuit from tonic through the other chords back to tonic that we can have. Okay? And I call that a well-formed progression. Yes?
Could there ever be a situation where if you wanted to continue the phrase, you could go from dominant back to predominant and then like...
Okay. You're kind of jumping the gun, but I'll address that right now. Yeah, under no circumstances do we have, if we have a chord that's in the dominant functioning box, under no circumstances do we follow it with a chord in the predominant box, because that is backwards tonal motion. It's considered to be a retrogression, not a progression, and it is frowned upon. I guess I don't know how else you say it. It's not cool in this style.
So can you just keep going through the dominant chords then? Can you just keep cycling through 5/7?
Okay, you guys have tons of great questions. You really do.
It's like building off of that. Just
Yeah, no, really you do. Let me see if I can play this chord again. This well-formed progression, I can't even see it from here. What is it? 1, 6, 1, 6, 4, 5, 1. Okay, so we have. We know what we're doing. Okay? We're using the chords and their functions within the correct order. Now, I think I'll be able to get to some of your questions. Just hang on for a second. Okay. Let me tell you this. You're not, when you write a chord progression, you're not restricted to using only 1 chord from each of the box. You can use several chords from each function box. And that is as long as you use them all before you go to the next function box. Okay, so for instance, I could start a progression and I could go 1 in the tonic box. Then I could go in the predominant box, I could go 6, I could go 4, I could go 2. I could use all 3 of them if I wanted, because I haven't gotten to the dominant function yet. And then in the dominant functioning box, I could do 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, and 1. And that's a decent, good, well-formed progression. Why? Well, take a look at the functions. They're used in the right order. Tonic, all this is predominant. this is dominant, and that's tonic. So that's one thing that it's helpful to know about. Can I play, right underneath this diagram, can I play the two correct examples there for you? Let's do the top one first. This is in the key of F major. Do you see how those chords go in the correct order? Tonic, predominant, dominant, dominant, tonic. Okay, and it sounds like this. Very goal directed. Highly sensible sounding music. Can someone read for me the top right paragraph? I've been talking too much today. Yeah, read it out loud, please.
For the most complete progressions, one or more elements from each of the categories should be used in the order shown in the diagram to the left. Tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic, like 1, 2, 6, 5, 1. We will refer to these progressions as well formed.
Good, thank you. And by the way, root position or first inversions can be substituted. It doesn't change their function. So for instance, if I put a 6 on my 2, it doesn't change its function. You just don't want to use second inversions of triads, okay? Because that messes with them a lot more. We'll learn about that later. Yes?
So like, say you were using, like you were in the predominant group and you used the 2, and then you went to the 6, could you go back to the 2?
I would say so. I mean, you don't want your music to sound like it's just kind of treading water. You want to make it sound like it's heading somewhere. But if you like the sound of that, I would say so. Okay, could someone now read the middle paragraph on the right? Go ahead, please. Thank you.
Occasionally, the predominant is skipped, resulting in a tonic, dominant, tonic progression, like 1, 5, 6, 1. This is a good progression, but not as full as those which are well formed. We will refer to these progressions as acceptable, but not well formed.
Okay, thank you. So it says here, whoops, I lost my diagram. Here it is. It says here that in some occasions, you actually start a progression on the tonic function, but you skip the predominant function completely, and you go tonic, dominant, tonic. And that progression, type of progression, is allowed in music. It's good. It's just not as full and complete sounding as a well-formed one that uses at least one chord from each of the 3 categories. Okay? So when you skip the predominant category completely, and you have a progression that does something like this, where your functions are tonic, dominant, tonic, we call this an acceptable progression. Which means it's decent, it's according to the rules, it's good, it's just not as great and full and complete sounding as a well-formed progression. Okay? Acceptable progression. And you see there's one on the very bottom left of your handout. Let me see if I can. See that one doesn't have any predominant function at all? It just has a tonic, a couple dominant functioning chords, and a tonic again. And that's fine. We just call it an acceptable progression. And it's in D minor, and it sounds like this. No predominant chord, that's okay. It's okay. Still a decent progression. So make the distinction in your mind between well-formed progression and acceptable progression. Okay, the last paragraph on the right, let me read that quickly. It says, it's got 3 asterisks by it. It says, only in exceptional cases is the dominant function ever skipped, as in something called a plagal cadence, which we'll have to learn later this semester, and other progressions that resemble plagal motion, okay? So really, if you want to write a progression that skips the dominant function, there's really only one that I want you messing around with right now, and that would be the one that it calls a plagal progression, and that's this. Yeah, I would consider this an acceptable progression. But that's the only one without a dominant chord that I want you to even mess around with right now. Okay? Yeah, don't do 1, 6, 1, and don't do 1, 2, 1, even though those are predominant. It's just 1 to 4 to 1 is your best bet if you wanted to do one without a dominant function. All right, finally, under under no circumstances, as I said before, do we want to go from the dominant functioning chord backwards to a predominant chord. Take a look at the example on the bottom right that has the, well, what is this basically? It says like, absolutely not, don't try this at home kind of thing. You know, yeah, it's crossed out. Do you see how it goes tonic, dominant, but then dominant to predominant? 1, 5 to a 2? Yeah, that does not fly in this style of music. And I hope when you hear it, it sounds just, well, you know, to our 21st century ears, it might not sound so bad, but back in the day, this was unheard of. It doesn't sound like it's going somewhere very well. So we can't ever follow a 5 chord with a 4 or a 2. The 4 or the 2 chord come before the 5 chord. That's the way it normally goes. And what's the deal? Why is this one wrong on the bottom right?
Because you're going from predominant to dominant.
Yeah, and it's not this one. Okay? Two chords do not like to go to 1 chord. 2 chords, because they're predominant, they like to go to 5 chords. And this one sounds, well, it sounds alright, it goes like this. It just kind of sounds like you're wandering aimlessly. Yes.
For the play locators,
Yes.
can you replace the first one with a 6?
Yes.
Yes,
I would say yes.
Sicko.
Okay. So a couple other things about the chords in the predominant and the dominant boxes. It doesn't really say on this sheet, but this is kind of how they behave. First of all, I need to tell you that the 5 chord, or the 5/7, has the strongest of all the dominant chords. It's the strongest dominant functioning chord of all. The 7 diminished 6 chord, it has dominant function, but it has weak dominant function. It's like wimpy dominant function. But it still has dominant function because the leading tone chord has the leading tone pitch in it. It has the leading tone of the scale degree. And you can't have dominant function without having the leading tone of the key somewhere in that chord. Okay. 1, 6, 4 to 5, always together as a unit, that's got a nice, healthy, strong dominant function. Okay. Do not put the 1, 6, 4 chord after the 5, please. I know some students like to mess around or do that, or else they're just not paying attention. But the 1, 6, 4 chord comes right before the 5, and nothing else, nothing ever gets in between these two when they come together as a unit. You don't have to use the 1, 6, 4 chord. You can just use the 5 by itself. But if you use both, then don't put anything in between.
Can you have it repeat itself, so like 1, 6, 4, 5, 1, 6, 4, 5?
Yeah, I guess I suppose you could.
Okay.
Yeah, I suppose you could. Okay. Checking out the predominant box, again, it doesn't say this on the sheet here, but you see how all the predominant chords are 2, 4, 6. They're actually listed in strongest to weakest predominant functional order. So believe it or not, the 2 chord is the strongest of all the predominants. The 4 chord is medium strength predominant, and the 6 chord is the weakest of the predominants. And it's kind of an unspoken rule, but the reason I say that is because if you use multiple predominant chords in a row, like I did here, you always want to use the weaker predominant before stronger predominants as you move through the progression. That's why I like to use 6 before 4, and 4 I like to use before 2, because 2 is my strongest predominant. And it feels like as you go through the progression, you're gaining strength. You're heading somewhere. And that's the whole point.
Would you say that would be the same with the dominant and tonic as well, the top one would be the strongest?
Yes, like for instance, if you wanted to use 2 dominants in a row, you could go 7 diminished 6, followed by a 5. Although, usually one or the other of those are used. I guess it's not really that important that we distinguish that so much in the dominant box right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I lost my train of thought on what I was going to say. Oh, does anyone know why the 2 chord, as opposed to the others, is the strongest of the predominants?
Because it's closest to a 1 chord?
Okay, that would be a very good guess. That would be a very good guess. But 2 likes to go to 5, the dominant. Why is 2 have a stronger affinity to 5 than any of the other predominant chords?
Isn't there 2 in the 5 and 7 chord? Or is it just in one of them?
G, B, D, F. Let me think. Part of the 2 chord is in the 5/7 chord. Really what I'm looking for is the fact that the root of a 2 chord is always a fifth higher than the root of a 5 chord. And the interval of a perfect fifth comes from the overtone series, which is a property of nature. It's found in physics. I'll have to talk about a little bit about that next class. But like in the key of C, isn't the root of a 2 chord a D? And then the root of a 5 chord is a G? And whenever chords fall a fifth to the root of the next chord, that creates very strong tonal motion. I'll have to explain that and talk more about that next class. But that's why the 2 chord is strongest of the predominants, because its root is a fifth away from the root of a dominant chord.
So is a 2 to a 7 illegal, or is that just
Not illegal, just not usually seen.
Okay.
A whole lot, yeah. That's what I would say. I got time, do we have time for one more on the back? Yeah, do you want to take a look at the top example on the back, and that's where we'll stop? You see how when you have a nice, acceptable, or well-formed progression, it doesn't mean you have to stop your music. You can actually use the last tonic chord of one progression as a springboard for another progression. So for instance, I could have 1, 6, and then 1, 6, 4, 5, 1. And I could use this as almost like thinking about starting another well-formed progression. So I could go like this, 2, 6, 5, and 1. And here is another well-formed progression. Here's 1, and they overlap right here. Does that make sense? That's kind of what's happening on the top example. The final tonic chord at the end of the first well-formed progression, which is in the middle of the example, serves as the launching tonic for the next well-formed progression that finishes the passage. So we have... I really would like to keep talking about this because it's just so fascinating how you can finally start to understand how the chords fit and work with each other. But I did run out of time. So, what we're going to do is, for your assignment, and this is going to be for Wednesday, remember, no class on Monday. I'm just going to give you a really short one-sided handout. All you do is fill in the chords in the proper boxes based on your handout. And then I've got a really short part-writing example here that I want you to label the chords, not only their Roman numerals, but I want you to label their function as tonic, predominant, or dominant. Okay? So this will be for Wednesday. And I think this is all that there is for Wednesday. We'll pick up this discussion on Wednesday next week. It'll seem like a lifetime, but there's definitely more to learn and understand about this process. Will you see him?
He's my roommate, so he is.
Okay, yes, absolutely. Let me give you a call. Thank you.
He's in my basement.
All right, have a good weekend. Stay safe out there. I don't know if the snow has stopped, but I bet you the wind hasn't.
The drifts in my driveway are like huge.
Yeah, that's not good.
So if we agree with all of this, which happens?
Which one?
The 3 chord.
Yeah, the 3 chord actually, I would put the 3 chord actually right in the key, the tonic and the predominant. It actually acts as what's called a predominant. And in other words, it actually comes right before the predominant. But it's never really sanctioned that way, and it's never really stated outright in books. It's not official.
Yeah.
It's just that's where I like to think of it. That's where it makes the most sense to me, where it fits.
And also, why isn't a, okay, You literally
I know it's still strong, but it's too diminished.
Why is it still predominant, even though it's so diminished?
Well, because it has the same root as a regular two-track. It's still a two of some kind.
Whatever.
Amy, can you confirm?
It
She is
doesn't
more of a
have
child
to
than
be,
me.
it doesn't matter.
He's not gonna listen to me, but you're right.
Told ya.
Really? I'm not deciding.
I'm really not childish at it.
I really, in order to make the jokes I make, I cannot be a child without being boring. I'm stupid. I'm not stupid. I'm very smart, thank you.
I love it because you pick up all